Our hosts, Ayala Corporation, BDO, International Container Terminal Services Incorporated, and Samsung. Our gold sponsors, First Philippine Holdings, Metro Pacific Investments Corporation, and FINMA Corporation. Thank you to our donor, Consuelo Chito Madrigal Foundation. We also thank our partner organizations, French Chamber of Commerce in the Philippines, Dutch Chamber of Commerce in the Philippines, and British Chamber of Commerce in the Philippines, as well as our media partners, Business World and the Philippine Star. We encourage everyone to please use our official event hashtags in posting photos and videos of this event. Our hashtags are hashtag AFES-AIM 2025 and hashtag AFES with Jaza. We would like to remind everyone to accomplish our survey forms, which you may access by scanning the QR code on your tables. Answering the poll also qualifies you for our special raffle draws today. Winners will be announced later and prizes may be claimed at the AIM booth. In the meantime, we are happy to announce the winners of yesterday's lucky draws for participating survey respondents. Please take a look at the screen now. Congratulations to all our winners. You may claim your prizes at the registration area during the breaks. Ladies and gentlemen, the morning session of the second and final day of AFES is about to start. Kindly put your phones and other mobile devices on mute or silent mode. As we begin day 2 of our forum, let's take a look back at the highlights of day 1.
Welcome to this year's AFES, the Asian Forum on Enterprise for Society.
AFES 25, with your active leadership and engagement, we can seize this historic opportunity and help illuminate a path to a vibrant future. Let us work together to realize a better world. We can create the future we want. Thank you for your leadership and attention.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 2025 Asian Forum on Enterprise for Society. This is day 2 of our conference. Please welcome back your host, multi-awarded international financial journalist and head of programs and host anchor at Signal TV Incorporated, Miss Kathy Yang.
Hello everybody, a very good morning everyone. Magandang umaga po sa inyong lahat. Kamusta na kayo? How is everyone? I've asked everybody to be here bright and early, and here you are on day 2 of AFES. Is everyone primed for day 2? Yes! And I've seen some cheers and jeers with the announcement of the raffle winners. We'll have more of that. So the Asian Forum on Enterprise for Society is now on its 4th year of serving as Asia's premier platform for exchanging ideas, just like we did on day 1, on how enterprise can generate positive social and environmental change. So this year's theme is all about navigating that disruption. Enterprise priorities for a resilient future. And these are vital discussions that we will be having with global practitioners, thought leaders, business, community leaders, and captains of industry headlining in today's session. Now, today's opening salvo of insights and experience is a mere continuation of today's engaging and thought-provoking discussions. As we recall, we've had perspectives on global challenges like geopolitics, and that's one of the panels that I had moderated. Very interesting disruptions to businesses, technologies such as agentic AI and climate action, as well as inclusion. Now, all these highlight one key message, that real business resilience comes from balancing purpose with performance. Now, throughout these sessions, one clear theme stood out, and that is the need to redefine successes beyond profit and making sure that growth also support people, the communities we support, and the planet. In today's world, every investment has social and environmental effects, as you may have already realized, so it is very important to use capital wisely and responsibly. So moving from short-term profit to long-term impact, it really requires all the businesses here and all the captains of industry to think carefully about how we use those resources and to measure how we use them responsibly. So we carry on with our deep dive into day 2. Shining a light on this topic is the founder and chairman of Ankara Group. And he is to tell my colleague Bem that Ankara means more hope. Very fitting for day 2 of our AFES. He is also the founding partner of iClass Capital, a Southeast Asia private equity fund. He also served as Indonesia's Minister of Trade and chairman of the Investment Coordinating Board. He previously held senior roles at Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan. A firm believer in soft power, he channels his passion through music, film, and education as chairman of Vicinema Group, host of the Endgame podcast, and visiting scholar at Stanford University's Dorr School of Sustainability. He is also the author of What It Takes, Southeast Asia. Give a warm round of applause to Mr. Gita Wirjawan.
Very good morning to all of us. I want to express my deepest gratitude to AFES and AIM for hosting me and allowing me this opportunity to share a bit of my thought, a bit of my view about the region of Southeast Asia, which has about 700 million people, $4 trillion worth of economic activities as of 2024, immensity and diversity. Nonetheless, it's oftentimes obfuscated with the sheer inability to tell stories to ourselves and also to the rest of the world. To ourselves, it's empirically manifested in the little degree to which we trade with each other. We take a look at the intra-trade of Southeast Asia. It's about 20 to 23% of our collective GDP. Much smaller than what the Europeans can do. They trade with each other at a rate of 60 to 65% of their collective economic activities. Worse yet, to the rest of the world, if we take a look at the number of publications about Southeast Asia, thus far, there's only about 375,000 publications about Southeast Asia in the context of about 140 million publications about anything, anywhere, anybody. That's about 0.276% of all publications available around the world. It just doesn't make any sense for me for the region that represents about 9% of the global population to be narrated only to the extent of 0.276%. Now, I think it boils down to a few things, but one structural element that must be recognized by all of us in Southeast Asia is that we probably have to understand the average number of heartbeats between the birth and the death of a human being, of a mouse, and of a whale. It's about 1.5 billion for each. But it relates to species that live throughout different durations, different scales. The fundamental differentiating factor that explains the different sizes, the different durations, is really the degree to which each species metabolizes. I would argue that the region of Southeast Asia has metabolized really well for purposes of peace and stability. And I speak in relative terms, and I speak for the duration of the last 2,000 years, where civilizational influences, religious influences, cultural influences, economic influences have permeated into the social and cultural fabric of all parts of Southeast Asia in a relatively beautiful manner. We have 250 million Muslims, 150 million Christians, 150 million Buddhists, 10 to 20 million Hindus and different beliefs, all spread out between the little town of Tanwe, which is the westernmost town of Myanmar or Southeast Asia, to a little town called Merauke, the easternmost town of Papua or Southeast Asia, a span of about 5,000 kilometers, equivalent to the distance between Boston and San Francisco. Longitudinally, latitudinally, between a little town between Nokmong, the northernmost part of Myanmar or Southeast Asia, and Boa, the southernmost part of Nusa Tenggara or Indonesia or Southeast Asia, a distance of 4,000 kilometers, equivalent to that between Tehran and New York. It just reflects upon the immensity of our region. Now, fast forward to today, if you walk from one end to the other of Southeast Asia, skip over Singapore, 80 to 90% of the heads of households do not have university education. I always talk about Indonesia, which is the country where I'm from. 88% of the heads of households don't have university education. So as soon as a kid walks or gets on a bus, gets on a boat, gets on a truck, gets on a rickshaw, from the home to the school, he or she expects to learn a bit more than what he or she could learn at home, at the rate that most of the parents within the homes do not have the necessary tertiary education. However, when he or she reaches the school, unfortunately, they're not getting the kind of education that they deserve, because most teachers in many parts of Southeast Asia only make about $200 to $300 a month, unlike those in Singapore that make about $4,000 to $5,000 a month. With $200 to $300 a month, you don't have a great ability to put food on the table for yourself, much less your husband or wife and kids. Your instinct is to probably want to work for Amazon or Meta or multinational companies that will allow you to put food on the table. Now, this is empirically manifested at the non-tertiary level in many parts of Southeast Asia, where the PISA rankings for 9 out of 11 countries in Southeast Asia are such that they're below the global average. Unfortunately, including the Filipinos, the Indonesians, the Malaysians, the Thais. Only 2 countries have surpassed the PISA rankings global average. Those are Vietnam, which, let's recall, was in a war until the mid-70s, and Singapore, which is now number 1 in Southeast Asia and also number 1 in the world. Singapore has toppled China when it comes to PISA which is a measurement of the lingual proficiency and STEM proficiency of the 15-year-olds. You try to take that to the next level, at the tertiary level. Southeast Asia has around 10,000 universities, including many in the Philippines, many in Malaysia, many in Indonesia, and others, with about 20 million students. However, only 2 universities in Southeast Asia place in the top 20, and those coincidentally happen to be in Singapore. The next best university in Southeast Asia is that in Malaysia, called University Malaya, which is not even in the top 50. Juxtapose that with the number of universities and students in China. We're looking at about 3,000 universities in China, 40 million students in China. And China has 2 universities in the top 20, but they have ostensibly projected intellectual power to the rest of the world, as manifested in the goods and services that are within your pockets, within your homes, within your cars, and in all the literary products that the world over would consume. Now, I think the hope for Southeast Asia is to make sure that each country is above the global average when it comes to PISA. The hope is that each country has at least 1 university in the top 20. We have 11 countries now in Southeast Asia. And the hope, by way of achieving those, we're going to be able to move up the needle of marginal productivity. We're going to be able to move up the value chain. We're going to be able to move up the global geopolitical order. We're going to be able to expand upon our pre-existing strategic autonomy. Now, from a geopolitical standpoint, I think the 21st and 22nd centuries are likely to be different from what might have been experienced in the 17th century upon the dynastic transitioning from the Ming Dynasty to the Qing Dynasty, when the Manchus decided to internalize and domesticate. And that resulted in a vacuum that was causing a geopolitical imbalance in Southeast Asia, as a result of which most parts of Southeast Asia went through 3.5 centuries of difficulties. To the extent that we hold the premise that China and the West are going to serve as countervailing forces, because China, I think, is pretty dogged in externalizing, and the West is pretty dogged in externalizing, they're both going to serve as countervailing forces, which intuitively means that there's likely to be a geopolitical equilibrium in Southeast Asia. So if we believe that premise, then we've got to capitalize on this equilibrium for all of us in Southeast Asia by way of the peace and stability, which is really sine qua non for any kind of economic development, so that we can learn to put food on the table better, we can move up the value chain, we can move up the global geopolitical order. How do we do that? I think we've got to learn how to increase our cognitive capacity, but also democratize it better. Many democracies around the world get trapped in defining democracy as a sheer distribution of power to the hands of many, without properly recognizing that democracy ought to be manifested in the democratization and distribution of public goods, which include healthcare, welfare, intellect, education, social value, and moral value. Those are key public goods that need to be democratized if we really want to be a proper democracy. Southeast Asia has 4 monarchies, of which one is an absolute monarchy. The other 3 embrace constitutional democracy. Those are Malaysia, Thailand, and Cambodia. Then you've got 2 countries that are single-party states, Vietnam and Laos, who can't call themselves democracies. But the others, Myanmar, Philippines, Singapore, and Indonesia, are multi-party states that have been on a democratization path. With that assumption, from a population standpoint, from a GDP standpoint, 83% of Southeast Asia has been and will likely be on a democratization path. Now, if we want to continue democratizing, I think we've got to recognize the need to democratize public goods. So that's the state of things today. Where do we go from here to tomorrow? Yesterday, a topic of AI was discussed. When you use your DeepSeek, ChatGPT, Grok, or Gemini, a lot of people don't recognize that the energy usage is about 10 to 50 times more than a simple search on Google. I happen to also be in the film industry, which uses Sora, which a lot of people don't know that it uses 10,000 times more energy than a simple search on Google. Now, if you ask me, what would be the structural impediment for Southeast Asia when it comes to AI? It's really the energy or lack thereof. Energy is an underrated unequalizer. People talk about inequalities in the context of opportunities, wealth, and income. But people don't often talk about energy as the unequalizer. China, Japan, Korea, and the United States, in Southeast Asia, Brunei, and Singapore, they're each electrified at a rate of 10,000 kilowatt hour per capita. That's like the ultimate level of modernity. And even China and the US are thinking about amping up and ramping up when it comes to energy. The US has about 1,300 gigawatts worth of power generation capability. And the wait list to enter the grid is about 2,600 gigawatts, double the pre-existing amount. China has 3,300 gigawatts worth of power generation capability. The wait list is about double that amount. Why? Because either of these two is trying to attain supremacy in AI before the other. So imagine for countries that are already electrified at 10,000 kilowatt hour per capita, they're thinking of ramping up and amping up. Whereas we in Southeast Asia, outside Brunei and Singapore, are electrified way less than 10,000 kilowatt hour per capita. The Philippines, 1,000 kilowatt hour per capita. Indonesia, 1,300 kilowatt hour per capita. Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, less than 1,000. Thailand, close to 3,000. Malaysia, 5,000. So the calculation is, what would it take for all those countries in Southeast Asia outside Brunei and Singapore to go to first base camp of modernity, which I define at 6,000 kilowatt, not even 10,000 kilowatt hour per capita. Just to go to 6,000 kilowatt hour per capita from the pre-existing levels of all the countries outside Brunei and Singapore, we're talking about having to build about 1 terawatt worth of power generation capabilities. And if we want to use renewable energy, it's going to involve the cost of $2 to $3 trillion. That's a lot of zeros. Now, how do we get that? Well, let's take a look at the Philippines. You've got limited fiscal space. Your tax ratio is only 16%. That's the ratio of your tax revenues to the GDP, which is far less than the typical OECD country that runs at a tax ratio of about 33%. Your monetary space, which is your M2 or your money supply to GDP ratio, is still 85%, less than 100%. A typical developed economy has a money supply to GDP ratio of more than 200%. So the presumption for not only the Philippines, but many others in Southeast Asia is that we have limited economic space. The only way out is capital formation from outside, which is oftentimes called foreign direct investment. Now, for Southeast Asia, we get about $200 to $230 billion worth of FDI every year, of which Singapore gets about $100 to $140 billion every year. Philippines, about 10 to 20 billion. Thailand, Malaysia, Vietnam, each about 10 to 20 billion. Indonesia, about 30 billion. Why is it that the Philippines get disproportionately a lot less than what Singapore has been getting? Why is it that the other countries get a lot less than what Singapore has gotten, including Indonesia, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Thailand? Because of two structural impediments. The first is rule of law, or lack thereof. Things have got to be enforced the way they're supposed to be enforced. They have to be predictable. Unfortunately, in many parts of Southeast Asia, the predictability is not as high as need be. The second is the lack of translational wherewithal. How do you translate from uncertainties, which are unknown unknowns, to risk, which are known unknowns? Risks are oxygen for capital formation because you can price it, you can quantify it, you can measure it, you can predict it, whereas unknowns cannot be priced, and those are not oxygen for capital formation. How do you get that translational wherewithal? I think it's correlated to the degree to which we embrace STEM. Now let's take a look at the figures. Southeast Asia produces about 750,000 STEM products per year. India, 2 to 2.5 million per year. China, 4 to 4.5 million per year. At the rate that we're only producing 750,000 STEM products per year, we're not going to be able to increase our translational wherewithal to where we need to be. To that extent, we're not going to be able to translate from uncertainties to risk the way we want to. Now, I think it's a bit of a mockery because at the rate that we're not able to translate from uncertainties to risk, we're not going to be able to capitalize or capture the necessary capital allocation, technologically and economically. Now, given the fact that we kind of believe that there is this global geopolitical watershed on the basis that China and the West are going to serve as countervailing forces, I think it just seems intuitive, for me at least, to look at China increasingly as a technological capital allocator. It's a bit paradoxical because our economic relations with China are humongous, manifested in a collective trade of about $1 trillion last year, whereas our collective trade with the US would have been about $530 billion. However, going forward, technological capital from China just seems more natural. Why? Because it's cheaper. Cheaper because they've been able to just convert from one to the next digit more efficiently. They're not great at 0 to 1 yet. And the US or Western technology is just much more expensive. And if you're a Laotian, Cambodian, Myanmarese earning less than $2,000 per capita per year, you're not going to be able to afford an iPhone, whereas a Singaporeans can afford an iPhone. The others, or many others, can only afford an Oppo, which fortunately takes better pictures than an iPhone. Now, I think the way forward, we've got to take into account how we've got to infuse realism in our narrative. In addition to the technological capital formation from China, which will be increasing over time, we've got to be cognizant of this massive liquidity that's sitting in the West. We're looking at about $140 trillion worth of liquidity in the West that doesn't get diversified out, despite the fact that there's been increasing risk premium in the West. Say no more about what's happening in the US. Despite that increasing risk premium, it's not being diversified out because of that lack of rule of law and because of that lack of translational wherewithal within many parts of Southeast Asia. Now, to the extent that Southeast Asians can actually remedy our pre-existing impediment we can expand upon this as to apply to the global south, which represents about 84% of humanity. Those are countries with GDP per capita of less than $13,250 per capita per year. This picture behind me is a picture of electrification as of today, and at the rate that the Philippines can only build so much or so little per year, and at the rate that the other countries, including Indonesia, with electrification of 1,300 kilowatt hour per capita and only able to build 3,000 megawatts per year, it's going to take more than 100 years to get to just 6,000 kilowatt hour per capita, including the Philippines, Indonesia, and many others. So you want to talk about sustainability? Well, I think sustainability requires technology, which is there already, but the economics is not there. Most of the developing world can only afford 5 cents per kilowatt. Unfortunately, as of today, all renewable energy alternatives can only be procured at a cost of 15 cents or more per kilowatt. So the challenge, if we want to seek an intersection between the narrative of sustainability and that of profitability, is to figure out how quickly that 5 cents, which is the purchasing power of the developing world, will go up to 6 and 7 and 8 and 9, and how quickly that 15 cents per kilowatt will come down on the back of technological innovation. Until such time those two intersect, I think we're all going to be exposed. I'm in the camp that believes that the technological innovation that's happening and that will happen will allow for that 15 cents to come down at a higher velocity and acceleration, as opposed to that 5 cents going up at the rate that we're witnessing so much political neurosis in many parts of the global south. But somebody, some institution, some nation state has got to take a view as to whether those two need to intersect, or as to, in the event those two do not intersect yet, somebody's got to put skin on the game. Somebody's got to take a view in mediating and bridging the two. Without which, I think the narrative of Southeast Asia, for the most part, will be a muddle-through narrative. That, I think, is the systemic risk that we're confronted with. Now, let me end with optimism. I've been spending more time with geologists. And I've mentioned this yesterday in a talk, because geologists have this great ability of thinking long-term. They can explain to me how a rock formation has taken place in the last 150 million years. It's important for Southeast Asians to take the long view. Don't get sidetracked, distracted, distorted by episodic stresses. I want to just underline the fact that this region is one of peace and stability tremendously. I can compare this region with many other regions that have gone through so many more episodic stresses with higher magnitude. But I think that simply underlines the fact that Southeast Asia is dexterous in embracing multipolarity. We're entering a new kind of multipolarity which is more pronounced. More pronounced in the sense that the world can see who's an enemy, who's a friend, and who can swing. And I would argue that Southeast Asia is a swing region. With 700 million people, $4 trillion worth of goods and services, we can, we have, and we will be able to swing to any which part, any part of the world. But whatever place we swing to, we've got to be mindful of what we're seeking. And I think if we're really dogged in wanting to move up the value chain, dogged in wanting to move up the global geopolitical order, we've got to seek that technological capital allocation. We've got to seek that economic capital allocation. But we're not going to get there without fixing the rule of law. We're not going to get there without being able to get better at translating from uncertainties to risks. And we're not going to get there if we stick to just the 750,000 STEM products on a yearly basis. We've got to move that needle to at least 2 million per year. And most structurally, somebody, some institution, some nation state has got to take a view on the compensation of teachers. I know I'm speaking in front of academics here, but rest assured, there are many teachers in Southeast Asia who don't get paid as much as they should. And I think Southeast Asia needs to understand, if we keep relying on the locality, on the local politics to remedy its own pre-existing problem, it may not get remedied. Lastly, I want to just advocate an idea which may involve changing the pre-existing structure of ASEAN. I think ASEAN needs to be relooked in the context of its supranationalism or lack thereof. ASEAN has thrived because of its principle of subsidiarity, principle of non-interference. It may be high time for ASEAN to interfere as it relates to educational attainment, because we have so much educational divergence, which has unfortunately correlated with so much economic divergence. And at the rate that we have so much divergence, and at the rate that we're going to have to deal with global challenges that are evolving at a much more exponential rate as they relate to geopolitics, technology, economics, and climate change, I don't think we're going to be able to thrive without remedying the pre-existing divergence. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gita. And that is a very, very broad overview. And I found a lot more hope than despair, I'd like to think. And that's the reason why he said that Ancora means more hope. Despite the systemic risks, he says that ASEAN can be a swing region. But we do have to take a look at the non-interference sort of arrangement and try to interfere to make a change and to thrive. And for giving us more hope in education and in putting more food on the table, everything that matters to each one of us here in the region. And of course, in relation to the Philippines, really trying to seek more predictability, isn't it? And that really resonates given what's going on with the anomalous flood control projects. That message is really all about being sustainable and being sustainably so through technology. Thank you so much for the keynote from Mr. Gita Wirjawan. He set the tone for today's unstoppable learning courtesy of our next distinguished speakers, and the set is ready. Here are they in the 5th session of this year's AFES. You are encouraged to send in your questions to the panel by using the QR code right in front of me. And I know that's going to appear just very shortly. Just don't forget to give us your name, your company, your designation, so we know where the question's coming from, if that's all right.